If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, editor, poet, and award-winning author of middle grade novel Jet Cooper, and I help writers identify and solve their story problems.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and a story editor, and I teach women who are writing in all genres how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
On today's episode, Valerie and I look back over season 18 and discuss what we've learned about the 4 types of protagonists and the premise. And we'd love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the like and subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. All right, Valerie, why don't you start us off by telling us what your big aha moments were with respect to your study of the 4 different types of protagonists?
All right. Well, listen, I think my biggest aha this season was just how many anti-heroes popped up. Holy smokes. I thought it was going to be way harder to find examples, although, to be honest, I don't know why I thought that. And I really like the idea of thinking about the anti-hero as a lost soul or as a hero who has lost his or her way. That to me is a far more compelling character as a moviegoer and as a book reader, but also as a writer, it's creatively more interesting to me because I think you can take that type of character in a whole lot of different directions. Now, we saw with 2 of our 3 anti-hero examples this season that knowing their backstory is important. Now, this creates the potential for novelists to fall into the trap of doing a big backstory info dump instead of revealing the backstory slowly over the course of the story through effective exposition. In Harley Quinn, we had a big info dump at the beginning of the movie, but at least they did it in a way that was visually interesting, and we got the information without having to have seen the first movie. In Serenity, you just kind of had to know the backstory. It was a movie where if you know, you know. If you don't know, this movie's not for you. Now, we also had a lot of underdogs this season, which didn't really surprise me too much, given that everybody loves an underdog. And creating an emotional connection with an underdog protagonist is, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's a lot easier than the other characters because we instantly root for them, right? We want the underdog to win because we have been the underdog at least once in our life. Lots of times we go through whole periods, like decades of our life, feeling like the underdog, like we're up against some huge antagonistic force that we are trying to triumph over. So, we just love the underdog. The most interesting underdog study for me this season actually is from Hidden Figures, because there, Catherine is an underdog to society in general, but to her own community, she's a hero. And because the audience, like her family and friends, understand that her genius or superior talent and skills are being willfully ignored by the powers that be, right, by society in general, we're rooting for her even more. So I just thought it was a really interesting juxtaposition of protagonist types that, taken together, made the story way more compelling. What about you? What were your aha moments about the 4 protagonist types this season?
Well, I had 2 big major takeaways with, regards to your study area. And the first is a bit left field, right? So go with me. But it's about repetition. And it became obvious to me when we were analysing Notting Hill that William's role as the everyman was presented many times via many means and by different characters. Now, this isn't the first time that we've come across this technique. So Valerie did a great study of this when we watched Erin Brockovich last season, and she highlighted that the powers of the corporation that Erin was up against was mentioned many times and in many different forums and via different methods. Now, why this is important is because the important elements in your story need to be repeated, not in the same way or using the same words. And the repetition went through a lot of the different types of stories, because it also happened in movies with underdogs as well. And I'm going to use Hidden Figures again because it was such a good story. But the obstacles faced by the three women in that story were constantly shown via the way other characters treated them, the rules that obstructed them, and even the location of toilets or different coffee pots for coloured people. So the role of the character is constantly repeated, and we saw it with the everyman, every woman, we saw it with the underdogs, and we probably also saw it in the other two types of movies, so the hero and the anti-hero. But it really stood out to me in those particular types of stories. And I think it's even more broader than that. But I really thought that that was very interesting and a bit of an aha moment, because I think continually emphasizing the type of character in your story is a powerful tool. In fact, knowing what needs to be repeated in a story and the way to present things differently is also a key skill. And if you watch these movies again, you will see how much repetition is used to emphasize the key elements of the character and also the themes. Now, the second aha moment I had were based on Valerie's or your exploration of the anti-hero. So just like you, I had a sense of what an anti-hero was, but I can't say that I had any really great definition or way to describe what it was. And the work that you started in Ronan and then continued in Birds of Prey and then Serenity really honed my understanding of the two types of anti-heroes, as well as some of their characteristics. And I really loved your area of study this season, and I loved Carl Iglesias's description of lost soul anti-heroes. So I really loved that as well. But what is your best advice or the biggest takeaway that you have from this season's study?
Well, here's the thing that we need to remember about the four types of protagonists, all right? And as a reminder, the four types are the hero or heroine, the everyman or everywoman, the underdog, and the antihero. Now, each type can be a constant character or a change character. Although my guess, Melanie, and I'd have to do a lot more study on this, but my guess is that some types tend to be mostly constant characters, while other types tend to be mostly change characters. So my big recommendation for writers is, for the genre that you're writing in, study the type of protagonist across multiple books in that genre. And when I say multiple, I don't just mean two, like 10 or 20 or 25, because I think you will need a big sample to really get a sense of a pattern or a type of protagonist that is presented more often in your genre, especially if you want to write a quiet, character-driven story. Yeah, so that's my first little bit of advice. Really look at the protagonist type in the genre that you're writing in. See if they're constant characters or change characters. See if you can find a pattern, because that's all about reader expectations, right? What kind of character are they expecting to be introduced to? The other thing, the other takeaway here is that we know that establishing an emotional connection between the reader and the protagonist is key, right? We must do it. It is non-negotiable, and we got to do it fast. Well, the strategy for creating that emotional connection is different with each of these four protagonist types. Now, I didn't get a chance to dive into that very much this season. But again, do some research and see if you can notice the patterns. So, for example, With an anti-hero, there is something about them that we admire, right? So admiration is the emotion. Study a bunch of anti-heroes and see, is it how that they're like Harley Quinn, choosing to prioritize someone who is disadvantaged over her own health and well-being? Is it like Malcolm Reynolds, who has a moral code he lives by? What is it we admire about the antihero? What emotion do we feel about a hero or heroine? What emotion are we feeling when we read or watch an underdog story? And the same with the everyman, everyone. All right. Now, Melanie, this season you studied the premise. How'd you go? What did you study? What are your aha moments? Lay it on me.
All right. Well, this season, I road tested 5 different methods or formulas to help writers create a premise or a logline. And the premise is the one-word summary of your story. Now, originally, I was interested in identifying which methods were more suited to certain types of genres, but I have to admit, I don't think genre played a big role in any of the work that I did at all this season. Now, while I looked at logline formulas and also premise frameworks, they do have different purposes. Loglines and premises have different functions, and so we use them in different ways, right? A premise gives you a sense of the ending, whereas a logline is actually meant to leave the reader or listener wanting more. So you don't give all the information away in a logline, but you can do that in a premise. So they have very different functions. Either way, having a one-line sentence you can use to write your story or pitch it to someone is absolutely essential. What I did reinforce this season was that writers need to know the following key elements of their stories, because these are what are used to create a logline or a premise. You need a sense of your character and what they want. You need to know what the inciting incident is. You need to know who the antagonist is and what they want. You need to have a sense of the plot, the disaster, the situation the story is set in, or the climactic moment. And you also need to know what stakes lead to give you this, where the stakes lead to give you this sense of the ending. Now, this shouldn't surprise anyone that these are essential pieces that make up a premise or a logline. And there is a lot of power in getting your premise right at the start of your story. Now, note that I didn't say perfect, I just said right. Because the premise becomes your guiding light. It becomes the principle which everything in your story must be judged against. And that includes your characters, your plot, themes, symbols, all of your story, and all the things in your story and the things you leave out of your story come from this one sentence summary. All right, Valerie, what did you discover about the premise this season?
Melanie, I loved your study topic this season. Being able to articulate a story in one concise statement, it is such a vital skill that all writers, all of us, regardless of the genre that we're writing in, we all got to learn how to do this. Now, I have created a premise statement before I've written a book, and I've written a book and then figured out what the premise statement was. And I got to be honest, coming up with the premise statement before you write the book is a whole lot easier. Way easier. And I do have the John Truby book that you mentioned this season. Now, I'd forgotten that he uses this whole idea as a way of testing a story idea. I think that's a great approach. Test the idea before spending years writing it. I mean, it makes sense to me. So I'm going to get that book out again and have another look and refresh my memory. But it's the way to go as far as I'm concerned. Now, there's something that I noticed, and I can't say it was a huge surprise to me or an aha moment, but it was more of a validation than anything, or maybe a reassurance that my thinking on this topic is right, or, along the right lines. And it's this. Every single approach that you studied this season essentially went back to the 4 story questions, right? And the best premises that you came up with this season are the ones that include this core information. When the core information wasn't clear in the story, the premise statement became far more difficult to create. I mean, last week with Serenity is a great example of it. What that means is that the story is harder to explain. So, for anyone having trouble creating the premise statement, that is, the one sentence pitch, you might not be clear on what the answers are to those four story questions with respect to your book. And I'll say one more thing on this. The premise statements that were most compelling were those where the protagonist was active. So it wasn't that something was happening to the protagonist, it was that the protagonist was doing something. In other words, the premise statements were written, the best premise statements were written in active voice, not passive voice. And Murder, She Said, which was the very first episode we did this season, that had a great example of that. Okay, so what's your best advice and your big key takeaways now about creating a logline or a premise statement about a story?
Well, I think we both agree, right, that the logline or a premise is a very versatile sentence. We can use it for query letters, back cover blurbs, synopsis, and most importantly, if someone asks you on the fly what your book is about, you have a prepared, punchy answer. So the sooner you get your premise going, the sooner you'll be able to talk about your book or your story. And what I really loved is that the premise forms the spine of your story and that everything in a well-structured story hangs on that premise. And I think that that is often overlooked and something that is underappreciated by writers in general. Now, I think I've proven that the one-line sentence can also be used as a diagnostic tool. And you mentioned this before too, Valerie, because if you can't identify the specific story elements, then it's a good clue that something is missing. Now, I've also proven that a premise doesn't have to be perfect, but it is necessary. Now, after road testing the 5 different methods, I do have a favorite method, and it's the one that I found in Dwight V. Swain's book, which he calls the lineup method. And I like this because it identifies the situation, the objective, and the disaster, because that's what helps me understand the middle build of the story, which is the longest and the trickiest part of a novel to write. I also like John Truby's method because it includes a sense of the ending. So we do have to know where we're going to get to. And I think that that's a really important part of his method of how he comes up with his premise. But the most important takeaway is your one sentence summary doesn't need to be perfect, but you do need to have one.
Whew, this was a big season. Okay.
Yes.
But it's over. So now we are looking forward to season 19. What are you going to study?
So I'm going to look at the ordinary world and how a reader gets orientated in a story. So it's not just the beginning of the story, but it's got a bit of world building in there as well. So I'm just looking at how do you get orientated, especially if it's a different world or something that we're not, or a world that we're really not familiar with. What about you, Val? What are you going to do?
Huh. Okay, I might be biting off more than I can chew with this one, but what the hell? Here we go. I'm just going to see what happens. Dive in. So, in season 19, I am going to be studying the middle build of stories, which is at least half of a story. At least half. In stories that we've studied where the middle build is less than half, there have been major problems. So, there is a saying that I have repeated many times, and actually, I think, Melanie, I think you said it in last week's episode. And it's this: the middle build belongs to the villain. Well, that, my friends, is what I'm going to study. How and why the middle build belongs to the villain. What does that mean? What are we supposed to do with it? How do we pull it off?
Oh, that sounds really exciting. That sounds excellent. I'm really looking
Exciting
forward
or
to
crazy,
that.
I'm not quite sure.
One of the two.
Time will tell.
All right, that wraps it up for this season. Join us next week for our What Went Wrong episode. And this time around, we're going to take a look at the Jason Bourne movie, which is the 2016 movie in the franchise, for those of you who have watched all of them and know which one we're talking about. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. For the power to write a best-selling story, visit storynerd.ca/courses. And to join Valerie's Inner Circle, go to valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle. And for more information about my books, visit me at melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.